Hey guys, welcome back to another Rework Retrospective video. Pardon me for taking so long to get the 4th episode out. I've been juggling way too many different things as of late. But we're back, and I'm excited to bring you another champion who initially had a reasonable amount of popularity, and it felt like he was one of the more successful ones. A few months into his relaunch though, and it became very clear that there was something wrong with his new kit. A lot of things wrong actually. Fast forward to the modern day, and I think maybe his rework wasn't executed too cleanly, especially after all the extra adjustments they had to make. Unlike Aatrox and Mordekaiser, whom a noticeable portion of the community felt were a step backwards, the design philosophy behind Swain was to maintain as much of his status as a hybrid between controller and battle mage to the best of their ability. However, trying to do so in a way that makes the champion feel fair to go up against is no easy task. So today, we're going to be going into Swain's rework, a retrospective. Mages are intermixed with controllers quite frequently on account of both classes utilizing ability power and having similar weaknesses give or take. As an example, Lux is a mage, but her light binding's long range and decent lockdown potential allow her to fish for picks from a safe distance, much like Morgana. Seraphine and Karma are routine enchanters, but their burst damage and trade combos make it so they can double as a mage on occasion. Those are well-known cases of mage-controller hybrids, but there was one who, despite having those very same capabilities, was never thought of as such: Swain. A rather interesting fellow. While other mages exerted their pressure through long-range missiles, laser blasts, and skill shots, Swain's playstyle was all about control, manipulating the battlefield to his advantage or his opponent's disadvantage. He was League of Legends' only battle mage catcher hybrid for a very long time. Battle mages could be rightfully described as the magic damage version of marksmen and juggernauts, champions with high persistent damage being able to go toe-to-toe with auto-attackers. What they may lack in reach, they make up for in area, as battle mages can effortlessly decimate large groups of enemies with their coverage, and Swain is no exception. What made him so dangerous was that it didn't look like he would do a lot of damage, because 3 out of his 4 abilities did damage over time rather than upfront burst. In other words, opposing teams who didn't respect his pressure and focus him down early would find their health bars depleting inexplicably fast while face to face with by far one of the best strain tanking mages, or best strain tanking champions in the game period. Just like every champion that came out way back in the beginning of the game, he had a very simple passive, Carry On Renewal. Scoring last hits restores a little bit of mana and a portion of his total mana on champion takedowns. Trundle and Cho'Gath have pretty much the exact same passives, but for Swain, it was rather necessary for reasons I'll get into later. His Q was Decrepify, commanding the Raven on his shoulder to fly to the target location and sit there for 4 seconds, upon which it will autonomously deal damage over time to the nearest enemy while applying a persistent slow. From a mechanical standpoint, it behaved exactly like Heimerdinger's turrets or Zyra's plants. Although the Raven wasn't a physical object, so you couldn't destroy it, the only way to avoid its damage was to get away. His W was Never Move, where he would mark a circle at a target location that would explode after a delay, damaging and rooting all enemies caught in it. This is where the catcher part of his kit stems from. For most battle mages, what little crowd control they did have was primarily used to deter enemy engage. It would either be too short in duration or unreliable to be used for picks. Never Move had a casting range of 900, not the highest number mind you, but it's far enough to where he can fish for roots, especially since at max rank it lasts for 2 seconds, the standard duration for non-displacement lockdown. Catching out mispositioned opponents was, of course, just a side perk of this ability, as its main function was to prevent his opponent from getting out of Decrepify's attack range. Swain's E was Torment, a point-and-click skill shot that would inflict damage over time to whoever he targeted, also increasing his damage to that target by 20% for 4 seconds. Basically, the only point of this ability was for Swain to be able to manipulate his Q targeting, as whoever he applied Torment on would cause Decrepify to focus on that enemy. It's a lot like how Malzahar's Space Aids or Yorick's Morning Mist would cause their pets to focus on that specific enemy, usually a champion. That brings us to Ravenous Flock, a toggle ultimate. While active, Swain transformed and sent out little birdies to all nearby enemies, dealing damage over time and healing him for each enemy struck. Now remember when I said Carry On Renewal was essential for his gameplay? That's because Ravenous Flock had a ramping mana cost, meaning the longer it was used for before turning off, the more mana it would drain. Until you got your hands on Rod of Ages and maybe another mana item, Swain's ultimate could only be maintained for 5 to 6 seconds at most before you completely gassed out, and that didn't even factor in the exorbitant mana costs on his other abilities. Old Swain was effectively a pure zoner. His Q zones away champions, W zones away champions, and his ultimate zones away champions. Though he had very simple abilities, the purpose was clear. His job was to place his Raven and himself in tactical areas around the map and in teamfights to hinder the enemy team from pressing their advantage, which made him an anti-carry champion. Contrary to other reworks where the motive behind them was because they had degenerate gameplay, Swain's playstyle aged rather well. Was it incredibly frustrating to go up against? Oh, absolutely. But like I said, his purpose was clear. He was this hybrid between a control mage and a juggernaut. Though his abilities look one-dimensional, he could be played in different ways. He wasn't like old Warwick who would walk up to you and press Q and R then kept smacking away at you until you died. Swain could play from a distance and slowly chip away at his opponents in neutral, or he could become a scary drain tanking raid boss right in the middle of a team fight. Each of his abilities synergized with one another, not a random assortment of attacks. Q and ultimate were his main damaging tools. E would be used to lock onto someone and boost your dot damage against them, while W would keep them in place so you can continue to get more damage on them. Very simple, but pronounced. So, why exactly was a rework necessary in the first place? Well, practically speaking, he's more like an old car you trade in for a new one because you can, even if your current one still has plenty of life in it. Swain's relaunch came out even when we still had old Nunu, old Pantheon, old Mordekaiser, old Kale, like a ton of really crummy champions that were in far more urgent need of a rework than the old Coot. All the same, he was an old champion who could use a bit of a touch-up. Keyword, a touch-up. The only major issue surrounding his kit was its superficiality. A problem with old champions was that their spells were just pressed for profit. Passive, free mana, Q, damage over time, W, root, E, damage over time, alt damage over time, plus heal. Cut and dry abilities run the risk of turning champions into stat checkers because the only element of outplay potential when playing or playing against Swain was to dodge never move. The implications behind this are pretty obvious, I'm sure. It doesn't make for very fun interactions when Swain can walk up to you, use Torment, and then Decrepify to repeatedly chunk you over and over again, while you can't engage on him, since the moment you do he pops his ultimate and it becomes a battle of stats. If you have more damage than he can sustain, you're guaranteed to win. If you have less damage than he can sustain, you're guaranteed to lose. That just came with the territory for a lot of the older champions. Some of them had straight up degenerate gameplay like Nunu and Pantheon who relied on cheesing you with an unfair mechanic. Others had cohesive ability rotations and playstyles, but were lacking in substance or individuality. Swain's passive was the same as Cho'Gath and Trundle's, Torment was the same passive as Malzahar's Space Aids, so on and so forth. There just wasn't enough depth to any of his abilities, not in the sense of being overloaded, but they could only be used in one way. To give you an example, let's look at Singed. His Mega Adhesive creates a puddle on the ground that slows all enemies on top of it by 60% and grounds them, preventing them from dashing. But it does have a conditional effect. If Singed flings a target onto the puddle, they get rooted for up to 2 seconds. Essentially, you have 2 different ways to use this ability. You can toss it at an opponent as a means of slowing them down so you can catch up to them, or you can set down your puddle, run up to someone and fling them onto it to lock them in place. That's what I mean by depth to an ability. It doesn't take an entire college thesis to give an attack substance. And now we arrive at its current form. Oh boy, where do I start? Okay, so remember how there are 2 different types of reworks, the modernizations like Fiddlesticks and Pantheon, and then the complete overhauls like Aatrox and Poppy. The 2 things Riot was aiming to preserve were his area control and drain tanking. They were essential to Swain's identity, so their intent was to pull a modernization, simply take his current repertoire and perform a retrofit. Yet despite managing to do that, they inadvertently changed the entire champion. Like almost every new release these days, Swain has a gimmick now. Ravenous Flock is his passive, where Swain can drag immobilized enemies by clicking on them and yanking a soul fragment, which heals him a little bit and permanently increases his max health by 5. Except for Q, each of his abilities have interactions with soul fragments. Let's start with Never Move. Instead of a circle on the ground, it's a projectile skill shot, dealing damage on the way out, then exploding at the first enemy hit on the way back, applying a root to everyone caught in that explosion. The point of the new Never Move is to make it easy for him to activate his passive, but in the context of his old rendition, they seem to have forgotten the whole point of this move, to hold people in place, hence the name Never Move. This ability changed from a source of lockdown to a source of pick potential when it should have been the other way around. Torment was just straight up taken out and replaced with Vision of the Empire, a long-range attack that does damage, slows, and reveals all enemies hit while also ripping a soul fragment out of each champion. Now, to this ability's credit, it does adhere to Swain's idea of control. You can use it to cut off escapes, to check for vision from a safe distance, or to support your allies with a little bit of damage with its virtually global range. But the problem with Vision of the Empire is that it doesn't really do anything. In fact, why isn't this ability Never Move? It has the same delayed circle attack mechanic, it just doesn't root. Decrepify was replaced with Death's Hand, which is just magic damage in a cone, so instead of damage over time, it's a burst attack. And finally, his ultimate. It's more or less the same thing in terms of its activation. He repeatedly deals damage over time to all enemies around him and heals from each target struck. It's also no longer a toggle, which means you can no longer use Swain's ultimate in the neutral game to push waves or heal back up. In exchange, Demonic Ascension gives bonus health for the duration, much like Nasus and Renekton's ultimates, and at the end of its duration, or upon recast, he can release an explosion to deal another burst of damage. Swain, a battle mage known for his constant damage and persistent area control, has now become a burst mage? Yeah, I don't know either. The response to his rework was pretty divisive, all things considered. Riot claimed to be upholding the core experience of him being a control mage, yet they went and completely changed every single one of his basic abilities in a way that I dare say was on the same magnitude as Aatrox. There was no semblance of old Swain whatsoever. If we were to compare the allocation of pressure for the old Swain, it would look something like this. 70% of his strength was in his basic abilities, each of them applying a powerful effect of some kind. An easy way to tell is to look at the damage numbers. Assuming his Q would unload all of its damage on one target, we're talking 400 base plus 120% AP, incredibly powerful for a basic ability on a modest cooldown to do that much. True, it's unrealistic to expect an opponent to bear the brunt of all that damage by themselves, but whether on one target or 3,
that's a lot of damage!
Nevermove did 240 base plus 70% AP. Not the highest, but it wasn't used for damage, not entirely anyway, it was for the root. Torment's numbers were 204 base plus 120% AP on a point-and-click ability. Also note that the 20% damage amp affects his other abilities, so they would do even more damage. In comparison, his ultimate did less damage per second to a single target than even his Q because it was never intended to be that way. Ravenous Flock could be used for all ins, but it was meant to augment Swain's already oppressive neutral game. His new Q, W, and E were made far weaker in total damage to make room for Demonic Ascension, which certainly does a heck of a lot more damage during all-ins or team fights, but there's something very wrong here. Swain's ult abilities had definitive applications to them. Torment enhanced Decrepify's damage and made it lock onto a single target, with Nevermove being used to ensure his target would suffer a large chunk of Q's duration. Each ability worked off of one another alongside their separate applications. Death's Hand, Vision of the Empire, and the current Nevermove have no synergy with each other, 3 random abilities that exist for their own purposes. Normally, reworks are supposed to solve a champion's lack of ability cohesion. Pantheon's a great example. He used to have 3 abilities that all did their own thing, not playing off of one another. Now, thanks to Mortal Will, a typical engage will look something like Empowered W, triple auto, Q, then auto again before using Empowered E to protect yourself from enemy fire while putting on extra burst damage. His basic abilities were improved to interact with one another on top of their separate uses. Swain's new gameplay feels like he just throws W and E at you to stack soul fragments for late game like he's a Veigar or Nasus, who have notoriously exploitable early games. He not only lost his amazing neutral game, but his kit was replaced with 3 incompatible spells. That's actually why he's played more often in support than mid or top, because he's so weak by himself now. One other problem to his whole design is his lack of an optimal range. In League of Legends, range is super important since champions have such low base tempo, and therefore they rely on attacks and abilities to bridge the gap between them and their opponent. That's why ranged champions are so frustrating to deal with as melee if you don't have a gap closer. If we were to look at a mage like Ahri, Orb of Deception has a max range of 900, Foxfire 725, Charm 1000, and Spirit Rush 500 for the dash and 500 for the damage, so about 1000. Given how her playstyle works though, she can effectively exert her pressure at around 725 to 750. That's her optimal range. There is so much incongruity between the range of Swain's abilities. He has a low cooldown short range burst option, a long range scouting / poke tool, and exclusively mid-range root and then a short ranged ultimate. I say exclusively because Nevermove functions like Ahri's Orb of Deception, where it's easier to land both instances of damage and subsequently the root if you hit someone at the farthest point of attack rather than point blank. Having an optimal range is what determines how intuitive a champion is to play, because the mind automatically develops habits based on visual space. Players are more likely to pick other champions that have the same optimal range as who they're currently playing because they're already adjusted to that distance. They develop a preference for what is familiar to them. Darius mains will find themselves right at home with Set or Mordekaiser, but may feel a bit of initial discomfort with Ryze or Teemo since they're not used to playing someone who isn't right in their opponent's faces. I do want to give Riot some credit here though. The new Swain definitely looks better. I think they did a fantastic job with his visuals, painting him as this old yet experienced, intimidating, and imposing general. And let's not forget his new voice lines, of course.
I do so enjoy explaining things to idiots.
But I'm honestly confused at how badly they messed up a champion who, quite frankly, only needed a couple touch-ups to his abilities. There's no rhyme or reason to the Grand General anymore, at least in my eyes. Swain's old identity was discarded and replaced with a champion who has a gimmick that encourages him to play from afar, but at the same time a Q and ultimate that incentivizes going all in. If you're going to make a raid boss ultimate, that champion should have a natural desire to rush head-on into the field of battle. Renekton, Nasus, Aatrox, they go Super Saiyan because their entire gimmick is about running straight into the enemy team and 1v9ing. Swain has no desire to do that outside of his ultimate, which alludes to the problems I talked about earlier. I do apologize for being overly critical in this video, but I think Swain's rework deserves more scrutiny. Again, I understand what they were trying to do with this rework, and I have seen games where Swain could solo 1v9 teamfights, but from a design standpoint, however, this one fell flat on his face. So many old Swain fans were disappointed in his rework, largely because it tried to fix what wasn't broken. I'm sure they would have been much happier if they did a Fiddlesticks type rework to him, keeping everything more or less the same except maybe replacing Torment with something more practical, like how they changed Fiddle's E from a point and click projectile to an AoE slash. But that's about it for today. Hope you got something out of this. If you're someone who thinks he came out a lot better, I'd like to hear your explanation behind it, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments down below. For now, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like to show your support. Also, be sure to sub to the channel for more content like this, follow me on Twitter and join my Discord server, and lastly check out my other retrospectives if you haven't yet. Until next time though, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.